The reading this morning is from a collection by Martin Buber called Tales of Angels, Spirits, and Demons. It's taken from a time in Eastern Europe when the Baal Shem Tov was active as a leader. This one is called The Angel and the World's Dominion. There was a time when the will of the Lord, whose hand has the power to create and destroy all things, unleashed an endless torrent of pain and sickness over the earth. The air grew heavy with the moisture of tears and the dim exhalation of sighs that clouded it over. Even the legions that surrounded his throne were not immune to the hovering sadness. One angel, in fact, was so deeply moved by the sufferings that he saw that his soul grew quite restless. He could no longer understand why death and deprivation need serve as connecting links in the great chain of being. Then one day the Lord called him gently by name and touched his lips, and then the angel begged the Lord to allow him to have the administration of the earth for a year's time, that he might lead it to an era of well-being. God looked at the suppliant with great love as he announced that he was in agreement with this request. And so a year of joy and sweetness visited the earth. The shining angel poured a great profusion from his merciful heart over the most anguished of her children, on those who were benumbed and terrified by fear and want. The groans of the sick and dying no longer disturbed the world's deep, surging harmony. And when the summer was at its height, people moved singing through the full yellow fields. Never had such abundance existed in the memory of living man. At harvest time, it seemed likely that the walls of the barns would burst or the roofs fly off if they were going to find room to store all their crops. Proud and contented, the angel basked in his own glory. For by the time the first snow of winter covered the valley, and dominion over the earth reverted to God's hands, he had parceled out such enormous bounty that the sons of earth would surely be enjoying his gifts for many years to come. But one cold day late in the year, a multitude of voices rose heavenwards in a great cry of anguish. Frightened by the sound, the angel journeyed down to earth and, dressed as a pilgrim, entered the first house along the way. The people there, having threshed the grain and ground it to flour, had then started baking bread. But alas, when they took it out of the oven, it fell to pieces, and the pieces were unpalatable. They filled the mouth with a disgusting taste like clay. And that's precisely what the angel found at the second house and the third house, and everywhere he went. People were lying on the floor, tearing their hair and cursing the king of the world, who had deceived their miserable hearts with this false blessing. The angel flew away and collapsed at the heart of his master. "Lord," he cried, "help me to understand where my power and judgment were lacking." And then God raised his voice and said, "Behold, a truth which is known to me and only to me from the beginning of time, a truth too deep and dreadful for your delicate, generous hands, my sweet apprentice. It is this, that the earth must be nourished with putrefaction and covered with shadows, that its seeds may bring forth. And it is this, that souls must be made fertile with flood and sorrow, that through them the great work may be born." Our next hymn is number 199, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." But before we sing, I feel the need to explain it a little. This was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s favorite hymn. But some of you may wonder why we're singing it this morning, or why it's in our hymnal at all. So I'm going to explain that to you. Mark Bellatini, the chairman of the hymnal commission that chose the songs in our gray hymnal, tells a story of how some decades before Dr. Martin Luther King graduated from Morehouse College, another man named Thomas Dorsey did as well, but although his father was also a preacher, he turned his work to music rather than to the pulpit, and he turned out to be a musician of no mean skill, singing in smoky clubs with Ma Rainey herself. And then after a stretch of somewhat unfocused living, he began to put his musical genius directly into the service of his church. People began referring to Dorsey as the father of gospel music. They even referred to his songs as Dorsey's. In 1932, when Dorsey arrived in St. Louis for a church meeting, he found a telegram that said to return to Chicago right away. His beloved wife, 9 months pregnant, had suddenly taken ill. He tore back to Chicago only to find that his wife had died in childbirth. His infant son survived for 2 days and then also died. Dorsey was destroyed. He locked himself in his room without food or human contact for 3 full days, but when he came out, he brought with him this hymn, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." Bellatini went on to say that when the members of the UU Hymnal Commission spoke in public about putting Dorsey's song in the hymnal, people protested. They said, "You can't have any Lord language in the new book, and the text is so depressing. I'm tired, I'm weak, I'm worn. Who wants to hear that or sing it?" Well, maybe somebody who feels that way. Bellatini said, "So we put the hymn in the book anyway, just the way Dorsey wrote it. It's a good hymn. He's not praying to some capricious God to restore his wife and child. He's simply a man who's lost everything, crying out for strength to keep on going. This is the very God that Dr. King preached decades later. No wonder it was his favorite hymn. The desire to be held and comforted is not childish or theologically inferior to some of our more stoic or self-sufficient philosophies. In fact, the opposite may often be true. I think, he says, a case can be made that some of our more self-sufficient theologies too often arise from extraordinary blessing and not out of human need. They rise from security, not from want. And like King before him, Dorsey relied on the strength of a nonpartisan God to bring a way out of no way, a new life out of utter desolation. Both Dorsey and King lived their lives in the faith that any Goliath, social or personal, could and indeed should be brought down by ordinary and creative human efforts. Is this faith really so much different from a Unitarian Universalist defending the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the imperative to make sure that it is true for every person? I, for one, don't think that it is. Please stand as you're willing and able, and let's join in singing. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I'm tired, I'm weak, I'm worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious the darkness appears, and the light grows near, and the day is past and gone. At the river stand, at my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. Please be seated. So, let's talk about death. I know nobody wants to come to church and talk about death, but I'm told that part of a minister's job is to talk about the tough stuff. Only pastors are allowed to raise topics like death and dying. And we no longer talk hell from this pulpit, but death. Your death and mine, the death of our loved ones. Death is undeniable. And I have news for you. We're all going to die. I can even tell you when. Sometime within the next century, you and me and all of our loved ones will have died. Death is horrible, but death is. Some of us remain convinced that death is some sort of cosmic mistake, an error in creation that we would not make if we had it to do over. But like Buber's angel, we will all eventually come to acknowledge that hard though it must be at times, death comes to us all. Dylan Thomas advised, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." We might be inclined to ask, so how's that working out for you? As much as we don't want to be reminded about our own deaths, much as we try to shield our children and ourselves from that reality, our culture seems to be preoccupied with death in a slightly weird and unreflective way. A visitor from a foreign planet watching a day's worth of TV might well conclude that we're obsessed with death, or at least fascinated by it. Consider the wave of vampire and zombie TV series and movies over the past few years. You may have missed Abraham Lincoln Vampire Killer a few years ago. That one earned $106 million. There's the Resident Evil series, The Walking Dead, now on AMC, just starting its new season. The Twilight Saga with its handsome vampires and beautiful but innocent young girls. And of course, every Halloween, we run across a few good zombie or vampire or general terror movies. Annabelle is one of this year's picks. And of course, the glut of detective and cop shows on TV get a lot of their satisfaction from the proximity of their protagonists to murder or death by other means. So while we push our own death out of our consciousness, we consume entertainment that allows us to observe the usually violent deaths of others, maybe in the hope that it will in some way vaccinate us against what we fear for ourselves. There's a reason why Halloween and All Saints and All Souls Days fall at this time of the year. This is a liminal time as nature goes into hibernation and so much beauty dies around us as we move from a time of light to a time of darkness, no matter how hard we fend it off by adjusting our clocks and the time to spring forward and fall back. And there's an uncanny reminder just now that everything ends. Our ancestors and many of our contemporaries believe that this time a thin membrane separates the dead from the living. Halloween is a reminder, of course, of the scariness of things that are associated with death. Ghosts, skeletons, graves, witches, vampires, and of course many other fancies and fantasies, superheroes, princesses, robots, and a whole host of others. In our society, we remember just a little bit of the scary part on those days around All Hallows, toned down to be age appropriate, smoothed over with a liberal supply of chocolate to be sure. But sometimes we overlook the remembering that also goes with these 3 days, All Hallows Eve, All Hallows, or All Saints, and All Souls. There are many variants in Christian and other traditions in how these days are celebrated, but at least some of the themes go all the way back to the pre-Christian Celtic festival of Samhain, which marked the end of the lighter part of the year and the beginning of the darker part. The ancient Celts believed that the border between this world and the other world became thin on Samhain, allowing spirits, both harmless and harmful, to pass through. So the family's ancestors were honored and invited home, while harmful spirits were warded off. They believed that only a thin membrane separated the living and the dead, especially on the eve of All Hallows. The Mexican Day of the Dead honors a similar tradition by gathering families for picnics and celebrations in graveyards, where those who've gone before are buried, experiencing the real presence of their loved ones on that almost magical night. So at this time we talk about death, about our own loss of loved ones, and about the fact that we too are mortal. And in talking, it behooves us to remember, to prepare, and to be present. We remember. We say the names of those we've loved and lost as we hold their memory near. We remember that all of them are part of who we are, that we're formed in part by those who've lived before us and those who've died before us. Our lives are woven of tapestries of memory. Our bodies are formed by the DNA of our parents and our grandparents, and so on back through the ages. And our minds are formed by all of those that we've held dear. In that light, ancestor worship, or at least remembering and holding ancestors in reverence, comes to seem not a foolish superstition, but an expression of the truth of our embeddedness in the stream of human life through all the ages. And so it is that we gather soon after a loved one has died to have a memorial service and to create the beginnings of that tapestry of memories to help contain our grief. In the same way, it is fitting that we find a time here each year to strengthen that tapestry and to renew together in this, our beloved community, our gratitude for the lives that we've been privileged to share. The first year after a loved one dies is always the hardest, as each holiday, each birthday, each mourning for a time brings to mind the one who's no longer with us. In the Jewish tradition, a headstone is unveiled at the end of the year to mark the end of these most difficult days. Sometimes we find informal rituals for marking the passage of those days and those months. My brother, my mother, and I decided to take a trip back to Madison to see the marker that had just been laid on my dad's grave towards the end of August. And we stood there remembering. But as the day went on, we ended up taking a tour of all 5 of the graveyards where our grandparents and uncles and aunts and loved ones were buried all around southeastern Wisconsin. At each place, we brought those who rested there to mind. The most poignant memory, though, was that once in a while we couldn't find a grave or a house where someone had been born or had died, and we realized that Dad would have known, but now he's gone. We remember. And then the remembering brings to mind that we must prepare. In ancient Rome, when a general returned from a triumphal war, bringing back captives and treasure, he was given a triumphal march through the city, celebrating all that he had accomplished. And a slave was dispatched to stand just behind the general in the chariot, whispering, "Memento mori." Remember that you are mortal, that even at the moment of greatest triumph and glory, you must remember that even the most exalted among us will come to the end of our days. Preparing for our own death is work, hard and often distasteful work. We need in particular to consider how we wish to live out the end of our days. We need to prepare advance directives and choose a trusted healthcare proxy. We need to decide what sort of heroic medical efforts, if any, we will want undertaken. And we have to make that clear that when it's time for us to leave, we will be ready. Above all, we need to be willing to talk to those who will be left to make those decisions about our hopes and expectations and wishes about how we'll be cared for at the close of our days. I'm grateful that my parents, my brother, and I have been going over that ground for over a decade before my dad died. And even so, those decisions are never easy. When my dad got pneumonia, we realized that the question of whether he ought to be given an antibiotic in that event had never entered our minds. I was grateful that my brother led us in a pact with each other that no matter what decisions any of us made about Dad's care, we would not allow it to create conflict between us. This had happened in our family. It might have happened in yours when an uncle died and it became a source of conflict and pain and grief and anger afterwards. Part of our own responsibility is to prepare. We must not leave it to those who will care for us uncertain or divided in our wishes. And we have to talk about it over a course of years so that everyone knows our intentions before they need to know. We need to prepare ourselves. There are tasks to carry out toward the end of our own lives. Reconciliation, if that's possible. Expressions of love whenever possible. And acceptance. We each have our own path to find in our last days. Some years ago, I was teaching a class based on the book From Aging to Saging by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi at Linden Ponds, the retirement community at the south side of Hingham. One of the images in the class one of the assignments was to create an image in your own mind of your life 5 years from now, to find a partner and to exchange those images. One person was left without a partner, so I went over to share with her. She said she had terminal cancer and she would be dead in 5 years. But her children were refusing to accept this reality, and they were avoiding her so as not to have to talk about it. And we realized together that she had work yet to do, that part of her job in these days was to help her children come to terms with her death and eventually their own. Her imminent death was an opportunity to help them to learn how to face the most difficult and challenging task of our lives. So she began talking to them as honestly as she could, sharing her own hopes and fears, how she wanted to be cared for at the end of her life. And by doing that, she opened the way to sharing that experience. And that helped to alleviate the guilt and pain for those who loved her most. It also ended the isolation that she'd been experiencing when the reality of her impending death remained unacknowledged. What to do for a loved one as they die will be the toughest decisions in the lives of those who love them. We owe it to them to prepare. It will help them to remember. And we learn to be present. The fact of our own mortality is always hidden away somewhere in the back of our minds. Hard though we try to suppress it, it still lingers there. It affects how we live, how we feel, how we cope with suffering around us. And the irony is that as we come to acknowledge this fact openly, its unacknowledged but chilling effect on our lives begins to recede. When we have faced that reality, we're better able to be present at every moment of our lives. We like to avoid making wills and plans and talking about mortality. It's grotesque. But it turns out that if we're willing to do that, the hold that the fear of death has on us begins to dissipate. If our days are limited, then our days are precious. It becomes easier to avoid engaging in petty arguments and strife with those we love or hate, remembering the wisdom of the words of the Buddha in the Dhammapada. Hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. This is an ancient and unalterable rule. The world does not know that we must all come to an end here, but those who know it, their quarrels cease at once. When we've accepted that we must all come to an end here, we can also be present for others who are dealing with the pain of loss. In the book Love and Death by Forrest Church that we are reading in our adult education class, the author tells the story of a young couple who had lost an infant of 8 weeks. As he's driving to the airport, they tell him about their loss. The mother says, "Sometimes I get the feeling that other people are having a harder time dealing with it than we do. It's so real to us. We know what we've lost. But other people can't face it. They can't talk about it. They're frightened." "They're frightened of us too," her husband added, "as if we had some kind of disease that they might catch if they got too close. With the whole world, our family and friends tiptoeing around us, we're left almost wholly dependent on each other. And sometimes the resources just aren't there." When we've planned and accepted our own mortality, we can be present to others with whom we share our common fate. We can share the grief expressed in the hymn, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." And this is about being present. Loss cannot be fixed. There are no words adequate to the moment. It's the custom in Jewish tradition that when visiting families sitting Shiva, the visitor says nothing until the mourner speaks. There are no words adequate to the moment. There's just presence, being with, sitting quietly to share the loss. And that's why we gather here in our beloved community of memory and hope, to be present to one another, to share, to lighten our grief and our burdens by being present. We learn to be present as we remember and as we prepare. And when death comes, says Mary Oliver, the poet, when death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood, and I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as a possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as the field daisy and as singular, and each name a comfortable music in the mouth tending, as all music does, towards silence, and each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say, all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I've made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.